thank you all for joining this press conference by Ms. Mariana Katzarova, UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Russian Federation. For all of those in the room and online, because I see many of you online in the hybrid briefing room, this is a reminder that this press conference is embargoed until 4 p.m. this afternoon, when Ms. Katzarova will present her report, her new report, to the Third Committee of the General Assembly. The recording of this press conference will be made available online after the embargo is lifted at 4 p.m. And with that reminder then, welcome again to this press conference. As I said, Ms. Katzarova will speak to you about her new report to the Third Committee of the General Assembly about the situation of human rights in the Russian Federation. She will brief you, she'll give you brief remarks, and then she will take your questions. And as you know, special rapporteurs are independent experts appointed by the Human Rights Council. With that, without further ado, Special Rapporteur, please.
Yes. Do I need to? It's on.
Yeah.
Sure. Thank you so much for coming today to this briefing. I'm sure how competitive the agenda of the headquarters in New York is. I'm presenting today my first thematic report to the General Assembly, to the Third Committee. It's on the subject of torture and ill treatment in the Russian Federation. The title is Torture in the Russian Federation, a tool for repression at home and aggression abroad. This is the very special link that I have tried from the very beginning of my mandate to point out, that the aggressive war, the full-scale invasion against Ukraine, which started 3 years ago in 2022, has exacerbated actually the repression against civil society, against any anti-war expression inside the Russian Federation. And it's torture and ill treatment, which of course existed in the past 3 decades. It's not a new phenomenon in the Russian Federation. But now, after the full-scale invasion, it has become a concerted strategy, a tool for stifling the civic space, for silencing all anti-war critics or dissidents, anybody who disagrees with the policies of the Russian authorities on leading their so-called special military operation, in essence, an aggressive war against the neighbor, against the Ukrainian people. This is also a war against the Russian people, because the mobilization of men to fight the war against Ukraine, and this is all documented in my torture report as well as in my report to the Human Rights Council just several weeks ago. The mobilization has been done in involving torture, involving ill treatment against any conscientious objectors or any Russian soldiers who decide, or officers who decide already in Ukraine that they don't want to follow criminal orders, they do not want to participate in the war. They have been subjected to despicable torture in so-called zindans, pits in the ground, or they have been suspended from trees without water, without food, while they've been severely beaten. Some has been shot in the back while trying to escape the war zone. There are many groups of targeted groups in the Russian society, including Ukrainians. There is a huge amount, maybe thousands of Ukrainians, civilians, men and women, and POWs, Ukrainian military, that have been detained on the occupied territories of Ukraine by the Russian authorities, military, security services, and then deported to the Russian Federation. They're lavishing in prisons in Russia, kept incommunicado, being tortured, subjected to electric shocks, anything from electric shocks to rape and sexual violence. And they've been not even charged, the majority of them. They've been kept in Russian prisons without any lawyers, without charges, without access to lawyers, without access to their family. And I recently, a week ago, put a statement, or even a few days ago, a statement. I invited my colleagues, special rapporteurs, because there was a despicable news of the death of Ukrainian journalist Victoria Roshina, who's been detained in the occupied territories in Zaporizhia a year ago. Then the family has been trying to get any information about her whereabouts. In April this year, there was one short message of one line from the Russian Ministry of Defense that she's been that she's held in Russian detention, but where, why, under what circumstances, nothing. The family continued to ask questions, and in the end, on 10th of October, the Ministry of Defense of Russia replied to the family saying, well, by the way, your daughter died on 19th of September. This was weeks past. No information under what circumstances and where is the body or anything. I think, and you would agree with me, dear colleagues from the media, I'm a former journalist myself, when men with guns fight each other, I could still understand, I could still follow the hostilities. There are still rules under international humanitarian law that we could follow, whether there are rules of war. But when the authorities of any country, and here we're talking about the Russian government, starts hunting down journalists on assignment, this shows a desperation by the authorities to really cover up, to silence the truth about the aggressive war in its third year against Ukraine. And from the known figures, about 25 Ukrainian journalists are in torturous conditions of detention, kept incommunicado, considered under enforced disappearance in Russian detention. At the same time, the repression at home, and talking of journalists, there are more than 30, so far as we know, journalists, Russian journalists, who stood up against the war, and they're in detention in Russia as political prisoners. This is only a fragment of the whole picture of detained political prisoners in Russia. I have a very modest estimate of 1,300 plus, but NGOs are telling me that there are more than 1,700, maybe even more. We don't know what's happening in many regions of Russia. But the point is that the authorities now are using tortural treatment as a tool for using it particularly against the political prisoners, how they're keeping them in torturous conditions of detention. Alexei Navalny was kept in punishment cells called Shizo and PKT for up to 364 or 367 days. These are, in essence, solitary confinement with really torturous conditions of detention in these punishment cells. And this is a punishment particularly used against the political prisoners in Russia. At the same time, nobody is spared, it seems. My report documents tortural treatment against, as I said, political prisoners, but also before they become political prisoners. These are the anti-war activists or cultural figures. I will be speaking today at the third committee, and I'll be giving the example that I could tell you now of a young poet who wrote a poem against the war in Ukraine. At arrest, he was gang raped by 3 police officers just to punish him for writing a poem and for having the courage to read it out loud at literary reading in Moscow. And after they raped him, they of course beat him severely. He was brought to a court, and the judge, although the poet bravely asked for investigation into his torture and declared, I was tortured, the judge turned a blind eye, as if she wasn't even hearing what the young man was saying. He later received 7 years imprisonment for this poem. And that's just one example. In Russia, anti-war critics receive really lengthy sentences. As you know, Vladimir Kara-Murza received 25 years imprisonment for 3 articles and 2 speeches against the war. He's now, thank God, free through the recent prisoner exchange. At the same time, a priest received 7 years for staging a service in his church against the war, or 7 years for a person who put the UN report on his social media about the war against Ukraine from UN mechanisms. At the same time, other groups of society, marginalized groups like the LGBT, it's very worrying what's happening with them, because the Russian Supreme Court last year a year ago, pronounced the whole LGBT movement as extremist, which actually carries criminal persecution and also carries lengthy sentences as extremists. Whether you're LGBT or not LGBT, if you allow yourself to wear the rainbow flag, you are promoting the symbols of an extremist organization. A young woman, that's my favorite example, was sitting in a coffee shop with her boyfriend, she wasn't LGBT, in Nizhny Novgorod, wearing frog-shaped earrings. So these frogs were sitting on a little rainbows, and a dutiful citizen in this cafe called the police, and she was detained. Thank God for 5 days under the administrative procedure, but even that's outrageous. And you know, in a society where you have really authoritarian rule, which actually quickly is marching towards totalitarian, you have a lot of people starting to report on each other. So I thought a lot about this dutiful citizen calling the police. And there is a famous dissident Russian writer, Duvlatov, who said many years ago, you're now all blaming you're blaming Stalin for all the repression against the dissidents in Soviet times, but who wrote the 5 million denunciations, reports on your neighbors? But that, I think, is human nature. We see it in many societies. But the Russian authorities, back to torture, in Chechnya, since 2017, the LGBT persons have been subjected to complete destruction, I would say, desire to exterminate them, really. This is a campaign started in Chechnya by the president of Chechnya, Mr. Kadyrov, to purify the nation. And yesterday here we had a side event. We had survivors of torture from Chechnya who spoke of, one of them was raped with a metal pipe, and tortured incommunicado for 4 months by the police in Chechnya. Men and women are subjected to despicable torture only because they are LGBT or somebody in the police decides that they are. Also, women in Chechnya are subjected to, by their families, to honor killings, as well as the LGBT persons. Because with the LGBT, after you're tortured in police custody, the police very often asks your family to get together, and they tell them, well, now you're free to kill them with impunity because they have violated the honor of your family. With the women who are not seen as in the Chechen way or patriarchal enough or Islamic enough in the understanding of the Chechen family, they are subjected to domestic violence. Very often they're trying to escape, young women trying to escape to the rest of Russia to ask for help. But then the police, let's say in St. Petersburg, returns them back to the police in Chechnya. And there are many cases that we know, but we don't have the real statistics of honor killings of women. Female genital mutilation is practiced in Russia, and I have been outraged by this. It's not outlawed in Russian legislation. Young children, young girls are subjected to female genital mutilation in secret, particularly in Dagestan, in some hidden villages, mountainous villages. But then, where are the authorities of the Russian Federation to go after these torturous methods. Now, even in clinics, it's performed sometimes in Russia. Back to other groups, indigenous people, national minorities have been subjected to torture and ill treatment, particularly during the mobilization for the war against Ukraine. The mobilization has been severe in the far distant corners of Russia, in Siberia, where small-numbered indigenous people live. Many of these peoples are actually threatened, some of them, with extermination, with their nation being depleted by number, because they have been brutally mobilized, forcefully mobilized by the authorities to fight in Ukraine against a law which actually, an old Soviet law, which allows indigenous people that are involved with traditional deer hunting or other occupations not to even serve in the Russian army. But here, with the mobilization, their rights are not respected. Unlike in St. Petersburg and Moscow, the military authorities go into a small Siberian village with indigenous people, I was told, and go door to door, dragging the men and sending them to Ukraine to fight. The same with the conscientious objectors I mentioned. This is a right enshrined in the Russian constitution for religious, for peaceful, for conscientiously held beliefs. You can refuse to fight any war. But this is not respected by the authorities where it comes to the war against Ukraine. I'm probably missing a group, but let's say my biggest, also one of all of these concerns are big. One of the concerns is about the paramilitary Wagner group, which has been recruiting for several years convicted prisoners to fight in the war against Ukraine. Now there is a law, and the military of defense officially recruits these convicted prisoners. They have been convicted sometimes for really violent crimes or for sexual violence, for murder. They go to fight in Ukraine, then in return for being pardoned, and then they go back in the peaceful society of Russia, where they reoffend, many of them. And first and foremost, they perform either they murder or they perform sexual violence against women, against children and girls. Now, in Russia, there is another law, recent law. If you're charged in a crime, but you decide to sign up to go and fight against Ukraine, you're exonerated. The charges are dropped. So we know of cases of these convicted prisoners. It's like a horror perpetuum mobile. They just go fight in Ukraine, come back and reoffend. They're pardoned for their original crime for which they were convicted. And then they go fight again. The charges are dropped. And then again, one person in particular did that 3 times. I mean, this is frightening for the level of domestic violence, violence against women, which is also escalating in Russia. And mind you, there is no law in Russia that outlaws domestic violence, not at all. And there is no specific crime of torture in the Russian criminal legislation. Russia is a party of the UN Convention Against Torture, which prescribes as a first rule that any member state has to distinctly include torture as a criminal offense in its legislation, with commensurate with the crime, with penalties that are really commensurate with the gravity of the crime of torture. There is nothing like that. And talking of justice, there is very little justice for the victims in Russia. Why? Because A, the perpetrators, even if the case comes to court, it's not tried about torture. The torturers are tried for excessive power or excessive authority, which carries really lesser punishment. But also because the whole judicial system already is so under a political influence that the judges are afraid. I gave you the example with the young poet. The judge was seeing the marks on the face, and the victim was saying, "I've been tortured." And the judge did not open investigation. And finally, What worries me, I've been working on Russia, on Ukraine, on Belarus, on this region for many years. I'm not Russian. Thank you for Russifying my name, but I'm not. I'm Bulgarian. You cannot be Russian on this mandate. But, you know, I wrote and researched the first ever report on torture in Russia with Amnesty International. I was the researcher on Russia 30 years ago, in 1997. And looking back and looking what's happening now, what's the difference? And torture is not just something happening in Russia. It happens in many countries in the world, unfortunately. But what's the difference is, especially after the Crocus City Hall terrorist attack in March, earlier this year in Moscow, there was a complete shift from torture happening somewhere behind the scene by this in police custody. Now it was paraded in front of all Russians on national television when the suspects, the terrorist suspects, who happened to be Tajiks from Central Asia, were paraded on national television, how they were tortured. The ear of one was cut by the security services, and the second person was tortured with electric shocks to his genitals. The entire Russian nation saw that on television. Then they were brought to court. This was also televised. Again, they were half dead in these videos. You can pull them yourself and see them. But the judge didn't really ask, what happened to you? Have you been tortured? Or to order any investigation? Of course, normalization of torture by the authorities is going on, particularly after this happened with the terrorist suspects. Let alone there was a whole campaign of police brutality against all migrants from Central Asia. They were stopped on the street after the terrorist attack. They were stopped, they were suspected of being terrorists, they were subjected to brutal treatment. Many had to leave the country because even the society was not welcoming them anymore. This normalization of torture, bringing it into the light, and in a way encouraging torture, because one of the spokespeople for the government were saying, I mean, I remember Mrs. Simonyan saying that on her Twitter. She was saying, oh my God, I'm so glad they were tortured, but it wasn't enough. They had to be, I'm glad the ear was cut and everything, but it's not enough. We had to do more. This is like in this Orwellian, speak that lie is truth and torture is good. I mean, it's really turning upside down. Obligation of the Russian authorities as members of the United Nations, as members of the Security Council, as an important member state, to actually the absolute prohibition of torture in all circumstances. This is now turned upside down in the Russian society. I'll stop here and I'll let you ask me questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Special Rapporteur. We're opening to questions. Edie?
Thank you very much. On behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association for doing this briefing, my name is Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. Could you tell us whether you've been able to visit Russia, and if not, how have you managed to find out all of this information about what's happening as a result of the war with Ukraine? I know some of it's public, but what other means have you been using?
Thank you so much. And AP has been a beacon of the free press. So thank you for being here and spreading the word, as all of you.
And thank you on behalf of my bosses. They'll be very pleased to hear that.
Yes, well, it's difficult because I was appointed last May to my position. I immediately on the day after 1st of May, on 2nd of May, I wrote to Mr. Lavrov and to the Russian authorities and asked for access to the country as any other special rapporteur of the United Nations. I also asked the ambassador in Geneva to meet and to engage in a constructive dialogue. No answer followed. I have been trying every time when my mandate is extended by a vote at the Human Rights Council. It was just extended in Geneva. I am now just about to write again to the Russian authorities. They do not recognize my mandate. How do I know? I mean, there has been an answer from them. Is because the ambassador in Geneva even came out last June, I believe it was, on national television, Russia 24, and he said, we're not going to recognize this mandate as a matter of principle. We're Russia. We're not just some petty country that could be scrutinized under such a mandate. And we're not going to communicate with this particular mandate holder because she's an active Russophobe. And even the journalist on Russian television said, but how is she a Russophobe? She's Bulgarian, she speaks Russian, what has she done? And the ambassador said, but look where she worked before. And before I worked, I was advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights on the issue of human trafficking. I was leading the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Donbass at the beginning of this conflict, 2014, 2016. I was for 10 years with Amnesty International. I was working with the OSCE. If these are Russophobic organizations, I don't know. I think His Excellency the Ambassador is really mistaken or misled to believe that the UN is Russophobic. I have turned my mandate into a voice and a bridge for the Russian people, and particularly for the Russian human rights defenders. I advocate behind the scene for them receiving visas because it's not easy these days to even receive visas to travel here, to travel to the UN. At my invitation here in New York today with us will be 29, I believe they are, 25, 29, Russian human rights defenders. These are the leaders of the Russian human rights movement from inside Russia and outside, because I wanted them to see that they're heard at the UN and how it works with the UN human rights mechanisms. How do I get my information, madam? First of all, I'm in constant touch with the Russian victims of human rights violations, with their lawyers, with the civil society, with the journalists, inside and outside Russia. And to tell you the truth, since the full-scale invasion, we have another Russia that is outside Russia, because a lot of people who disagreed with the policies of the government with the war actually left the country, or they had to leave the country, otherwise they faced imprisonment. I'm in touch particularly with victims of human rights violations, with their families. In terms of the Ukrainian detainees, I'm a seasoned human rights investigator, and I don't like just, and we shouldn't, just use your media reports in order to write serious UN reports with allegations. So I engage in first-hand gathering, first-hand accounts of interviewing victims. So, for example, for the LGBT in Chechnya, I can speak with authority because I interviewed earlier this year a group of them. They came from different countries where they were rescued now, and they told me of this despicable torture. I had 10 days a week of interviewing each of them individually. With the Ukrainian detainees, the same thing. The returned Ukrainian civilians back and POWs, through prisoner exchanges, they're returning back to Ukraine. And I'm getting first-hand accounts of them. Today, we have a side event, thank you to Germany for sponsoring it, at 1:15 at room 6. And if you're available, come, because we, at my invitation, there will be a young Crimean Tatar woman, Lenia Umerova, who was deported to Russian prisons. She just returned in September through a prisoner swap. And we will hear from her about Lefortovo prison in Moscow and about she visited her father in Crimea who had cancer because she was living in Kiev. And they detained her. She was a young journalist, a young student, and she was kept for a year. She's now back, and she's in New York to speak about her ordeal. That's a good reminder. We all need it.
Go ahead, Benno.
Thank you. Benno Schwinghammer with the German press agency. Thank you for the briefing. It's very valuable. I wonder, with everything you described, how much of the torture of enemies domestically or abroad by the Russian government can be traced directly back to Vladimir Putin?
I mean, I first of all quoted Duvlatov just minutes ago, the Russian dissident writer. I could also quote Svetlana Alexievich, the Nobel Peace Prize winner from Belarus, who was saying there is no one Stalin or one President Putin. There is a collective Stalin and a collective Putin. And I think the scariest bit is that in a totalitarian society, I actually lived in communist Bulgaria in my young years. I know exactly the level of fear, the level of intimidation, the level of non-freedom. You don't even need a particular one person to be calling in, the prison colony where Navalny was, please torture him. I mean, the president wouldn't do that. There are other peoples to do that. There is a whole system that supports the repression and support the aggression as well. I don't think there is one person that is responsible, but of course there is a system, but this system has faces. This system has faces of the actual torturers, but also the ones that gave these criminal orders. In fact, I would say President Putin, surprisingly, came out, I think it was in St. Petersburg Economic Forum in July, and if I'm not mistaken, he requested a report to be given by the government to him because he hears that there is a lot of torture going on. And this was because there was videos that came out of Russian prison colonies, and particularly there was this situation, it's in my report, in Irkutsk, in a prison colony a couple of years ago. There was, the authorities claimed a riot of prisoners, and what they did, they subjected more than 100 inmates to rape with the handles of mops. The prison guards then gang raped these people to punish them for allegedly staging a riot. Now, this case came to court. Although, the intimidation on prisoners, they're still inmates, not to speak about their rape, has been enormous by the prison authorities, by the, the leadership of the region. And it's very difficult. It's still in court, this case, but even the prisoners are afraid to speak. Now, there was no such report delivered. I've been monitoring whether the government suddenly will come up with a report on torture for their president, nothing. At the same time, we're seeing escalation of torture, and we're seeing, especially with the Ukrainian detainees, even the fact that they're kept incommunicado, they're kept without charges and in these torturous conditions, that actually amounts to torture and ill treatment. They're subjected to enforced disappearance, essentially. But now we see, according to the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, and that's a modest figure, I think, at least 177 Ukrainian detainees, I think civilian detainees in Russian prisons have died. We don't know how, we don't know under what circumstances, like the journalist recently. So tracing it directly only to one person would be wrong, because actually there are many torturers, there are many people that are complicit from the government within this machinery and this strategy of torture.
Let me follow up, if I may. I just wanted to get it very clear. Maybe I misunderstood a bit. What you're saying, so you're not saying that the whole system of torture is headed by the president, and you're not saying that Putin in the end is responsible for this system of torture. Rather, you say the exact role of the president is not entirely clear. Is that fair?
Is Mr. Scholz responsible for all torture in Germany? He's not. There is a whole government, right? President Putin is one person who is heading the government of the Russian Federation, the authorities in Russia. Then there is a whole system. You have the judiciary complicit. You have lawmakers complicit. They're not passing, they're not distinguishing torture as a separate crime in order to have accountability for torture. Then you have the military commanders that are torturing, anybody, conscientious objectors. Then you have the police and the military in Chechnya on the orders. Yes, you can say the whole campaign against LGBT started in 2017. It's Mr. Kadyrov, in fact, the president of Chechnya, that started this campaign. But the link with the federal authorities is they're turning a blind eye. They're actually, fine with what's happening against LGBT persons in Chechnya. You cannot, it would have been easy if we have one person to blame about all the crimes in a country. What I'm saying is, it's the government of the Russian Federation that is using torture as a tool for repressing their dissidents, their political prisoners inside the country, and at the same time, the Ukrainian detainees, and in the war in Ukraine, of course. This is now the military. But it's easy to blame one person. We change the person and then everything is wonderful. It isn't. Because we now actually have to talk about accountability, how to get it for all the tortures. And you know what? In my report, I have a call not just to the Russian government, to the international community. Use your domestic criminal law systems, including the powers of universal jurisdiction. Start cases like the one of the Syrian torture in Koblenz in Germany. Use your universal jurisdiction if your governments and your judiciary is brave enough, if you're committed enough in your countries to start cases against the torturers for torture in Russia. And that would be a way that we as the international community could start some justice process that the victims cannot see in their own country. Now that the European court is no longer viable for the Russian people. As you know, Russia was thrown out of the Council of Europe. They retaliated by the Russian government by leaving the European Court and the European Convention on Human Rights as a result. I hope I'm clear. Thank you.
Evelyn?
Thank you. Sorry. Evelyn Leopold. God, I'm losing my voice. A couple of questions. Can you compare this to the USSR, or is it just a continuation? And secondly, how much are people still being sent to the Arctic where Navalny died, and how much do we know about his death? Thank you.
No, thank you very much. I forgot to say that actually the punitive psychiatry has returned now full force, particularly targeting anti-war demonstrators and critics of the government, very reminiscent of the Soviet use of psychiatry. And what's frightening is we know of activists or anti-war critics, demonstrators that were sent to a forced psychiatric treatment, examination and treatment. What's frightening is you cannot come out of it. There was also a famous shaman, an indigenous person from Yakutia, who several years ago started marching barefoot to the Kremlin, to Moscow, because he claimed that something terrible will be happening, something violent, and he needs to go and do exorcism of President Putin. This shaman had a very big popularity while he was walking from region to region, and then he was detained by the authorities and put in a forced psychiatric treatment. He's still there. He's still in, because the system does not allow you to come out of it. I mean, the doctors are saying, oh, you have to continue being in such treatment, and it's again another carousel of continuing detention, psychiatric detention. In terms of the Soviet Union and the repression now and then, I would say, you know, I actually think the times of the Soviet Union were even in some ways easier. The Soviet dissidents were receiving, I believe, up to 7 years imprisonment for being against, you know, for being against the Soviet, the policies of the Soviet government. Now, the imprisonment of government critics starts from 7 years and goes up to 22, 25 years imprisonment. So it's really frightening that now are even more frightening times than during the Soviet time if we compare the level of repression. Alexei Navalny, quite visible and leading Russian political prisoners figures are sent really to faraway colonies, including in Siberia, including in the region where Navalny was sent, beyond the Arctic Circle. I think Maria Makarova, or I forgot the name of a journalist who was also sent, you know, to a far distant colony. I hear very troubling accounts about her her health and her psychological health health. She's even thinking of suicide. I mean, it's very worrying. Now, they do that, although this is another way of punishing the political prisoners because your relatives cannot visit you. I mean, this is a huge land, so to come from Moscow, I remember Kevin Leak, the youngest person accused of treason in Russia, who was released during the recent prisoner swap with Vladimir Karamurza. He was only 17, and he was telling me he was sent at such a far distant place to serve his 3 or 4 years imprisonment he received on charges of treason, that his mother could not visit him, not even once. It was so far. And also when people are poor and they cannot even make this trip. But also in these prison colonies, I mean, there are red and black on the prison jargon. There are different levels of restrictions and severity in these prison colonies where these people are. So some are really extremely severe. Navalny was in one of those. Now, what do we know about his death? Now I'm hearing about Russian human rights investigators that have come up with allegations that probably he was poisoned before he died. Again, the Russian authorities did everything for independent investigation not to take place, for independent autopsy not to take place. The body of Navalny was not returned even to his mother. She wasn't even allowed to actually be close to the body, even during the funeral of Navalny. This was so, you know, so disrespectful, even if Navalny wasn't Navalny, but just a regular person dead in custody. But it also prevented for us knowing, and the family of Navalny knowing, how really he died. Honestly, whatever the cause of death, whether he was tortured to death, whether he was poisoned on the orders of the high-up authorities, whether he was kicked by one of the prison guards and he died on the spot, or the torturous prison conditions led to the to some deterioration of his health, to his death. Whatever the reason, the Russian authorities are responsible for his death in custody, and that we need to remember and to. You know, I'm calling for accountability for his death and for any other. And actually, to prevent them dying in prison, I think I cannot, I tirelessly repeat the recommendation. All political prisoners have to be released. All Ukrainian detainees have to be released and returned to Ukraine. However, if nothing else works with putting pressure on the Russian authorities, at least I'm telling the governments of the world, use the opportunity of the future peace talks with Russia, because this war in Ukraine has to end at some point. And there will be peace talks. And during these peace talks, the first 2 points, which are not one after the other, but equal to each other, is release of the Russian political prisoners and release of the Ukrainian detainees from Russia. I hope I answered.
I think we have time for one last question. Go ahead, Stefan. Yeah, we'll do the two of them and then we'll need to close. Thanks.
Yes, Stefano Vaccara, Ital Press, La Voce di New York. Do you think, thinking back, do you think that the UN could have done something that didn't do to save Navalny's life?
I don't know whether the UN could have done something. I know I have been putting out all these statements all the time. When he and another political prisoner, Alexei Gorinov, disappeared last December for up to a month, I really, in a way, accused the Russian authorities of actually subjecting political prisoners to enforced disappearance. This is how I know that although they don't recognize my mandate, actually the system works, because the Russian authorities found them or presented them to the outside world after my statements on Christmas Day, 25th of December, in one day. I think I know that the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mr. Volker Turk, has been doing statements as well on Vladimir Kara-Murza, on Navalny. The governments that actually organized the prisoner swap, I think they have been having Navalny in mind, but then again, this is between governments. It was a government undertaking of their security services. I wasn't privy to these, negotiations for the release of prisoners, as I shouldn't be. But if they ask me for advice, I could give them a list of very ill political prisoners that are in prison that should be first on the list. Whether we could have done more, it's not just one Navalny, you see, that's the point. I think we should do more for all these political prisoners in Russia. They're not, they're 1,000, from 300 to 700, or let's say 2,000 people. Equally to that, I'm very concerned about the Belarusian political prisoners, because they have been forgotten, and I'm glad there is a new colleague, Special Rapporteur, who will be advocating for that. There is an independent mandate now from this year, investigatory accountability mandate on Belarus as well. But I also try to talk about the Belarusian political prisoners as much as I can. And all of this is on the radar screen of the UN. I think what we can do more, I always say to governments, please don't shy away to communicate with the Russian authorities and demand from them the release of political prisoners, of the Ukrainian detainees. At the moment, there is this kind of stalemate of communication with the Russian government. I want to communicate with them. They don't want to communicate with me. But for governments of the world, I think any opportunity for us to demand, for you to demand release of the political prisoners is very important, starting from the new Navalny's, because there are many who are Alexei Gorinov. By the way, in my Geneva report, I named them, the ones in the most critical condition. I included them in the report in order to be a guiding recommendation to states that may consider prisoner swaps in the future, or during the peace talks with Ukraine, public or private. About the war against Ukraine with the Russian authorities.
Dulcie, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Oh, thanks very much. Just wanted to get your comment on Russia recruiting North Korean troops to fight in the Kursk region of Russia. What do you think of that? And do you receive threats against yourself for your work? Thanks.
What do I think about the Korean troops? I mean, obviously, I think the government has been very worried about the dead Russian soldiers coming home. And I think the authorities have been afraid the people, particularly the more sophisticated middle class in Moscow and St. Petersburg, the mothers' movement, the wives' movement, which actually now is getting momentum. There was a recent demonstration of wives of mobilized men. They've been detained, and 10 of them were pronounced foreign agents by the authorities. I think the authorities are afraid of getting. That's why the forced mobilization far away of the national minorities, the Buryatians, the Chechens, the Kalmykians, the indigenous people, but not necessarily the blonde, blue eyes, middle class boys from and men from Moscow and St. Petersburg, because they're afraid of the outcry of their own society, of the mothers' movement, of a backlash. I read this as, getting soldiers from North Korea or from anywhere else. There has been also information, I haven't checked it personally, but there was media reports about private companies from Russia recruiting people in the Middle East and in Africa to fight in the war against Ukraine. But also I know of so many cases of asylum seekers, of migrants. Do you know, the police stops them on the street, these Central Asian migrants, and tells them, especially after the terrorist attack in Moscow, during the campaign against them, so do you want a fine, imprisonment, or maybe you want to mobilize and go and fight in Ukraine? I know it firsthand. And when the person said, no, I don't want to fight in Ukraine, I'm a migrant worker, I have my papers, they said, okay, then it will be a fine leading to detention. So asylum seekers have been pressurized. You can receive Russian citizenship immediately if you go fight against Ukraine. Africans, Middle Easterns. So I don't see it as something extraordinary. I personally think it's part of the Russian government's desire not to have the outcry of their own people. And these millions of mothers going to march onto Kremlin, which could happen because I saw it happening in the Chechnya wars, the strong mothers movement against the war. And mind you, President Putin promised that there won't be any recruits of the conscript, of the young 18-year-old conscripts, because in Russia military service is mandatory. And then what happened when the Ukrainian incursion happened in Kursk region? We saw at the border only 18-year-olds being sent there without training, they weren't trained to be in the army, they were just recruited and sent there. And mind you, the mothers of these boys weren't happy at all. And I think there is something brewing with the mothers movement, with the women standing. So I think, yes, it's frightening to get soldiers from North Korea. But this is the raison d'etre, I think, why.
Thank you, Special Rapporteur. We're going to have to wrap up. As you know, there's a noon briefing coming up. So just a reminder that this press conference is embargoed until 4 p.m. this afternoon, because that's when the Special Rapporteur will present her report to the third committee. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much. And your work is so important to spread the word with this mandate, because it's not easy. It's the first such mandate on such an important country, a member of the big P5s. And all your support of spreading the word is really very important, and I'm grateful for it. Thank you.